Coffee shop owner Keano Reeves, unaware of the hidden eyes watching him, poured his heart into every cup of coffee, never imagining that his simple actions would ignite a tale of mystery and unexpected intrigue. Keanu's hands trembled as he held the weathered brass compass, its needle swinging wildly before settling on a direction that contradicted everything he believed was true. The small crowd of reporters that had gathered outside the courthouse steps pressed closer. Microphones extended like accusatory fingers. Camera flashes punctuated the grey October morning. "Mr. Reeves, will you be pursuing further legal action against North Star Pharmaceuticals?" shouted a reporter from the back. "Is it true that you've been offered a settlement?" called another. Keanu closed his fingers around the compass, feeling its edges dig into his palm. The object that had once guided his father through wilderness expeditions now felt like the only solid thing in a world suddenly made of quicksand. He glanced at his attorney, Emily, who stood protectively beside him, her tall frame blocking some of the more aggressive journalists. "Mr. Reeves has no comment at this time," Emily stated firmly, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "The jury's decision speaks for itself." But did it? After 18 months of litigation, endless depositions, and 6 weeks of trial, the verdict had come back. Not liable. North Star Pharmaceuticals, the company that had employed his father for 27 years before discarding him when he became inconvenient, had been cleared of all wrongdoing in his death. "It's not over," Keanu whispered, too quietly for the microphones to catch. A flash of red caught his eye at the edge of the crowd. A man in a crimson scarf stood watching him, his weathered face familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. When their eyes met, he nodded once deliberately, then turned to walk away. "Who is that?" he asked Emily. "Who?" "That man in the red scarf." But when he looked again, he had vanished into the crowd, leaving Keanu with the uncanny feeling that the compass in his hand had just become even more significant. "Come on," Emily said, guiding him down the courthouse steps toward the waiting car. "Let's get you home." Home. The word felt hollow now, because the truth the jury hadn't believed, was that his childhood home in Oak Ridge had slowly poisoned his father, just as the North Star chemical plant had poisoned the groundwater of their entire community for decades. And the company had known all along. As the car pulled away from the curb, Keanu opened his palm and looked down at the compass again. The needle had stopped its wild spinning and now pointed steadily northwest, away from the city, toward Oak Ridge. Toward home. "I need to go back," he said suddenly. "Back where?" Emily asked, glancing up from her phone. Keanu tightened his grip on the compass. "To where it all began." 5 years earlier, Keanu had been living a different life. At sea. 32, he had established himself as a promising environmental scientist with a research position at Berkeley and a comfortable apartment in Oakland. He kept in regular contact with his father, Daniel Reeves, a widower who still lived in their family home in Oak Ridge, the small town where he'd grown up. Daniel had worked as a chemical engineer at North Star Pharmaceuticals since before Keanu was born. A brilliant but humble man, he'd passed up opportunities for advancement to remain in the research division he loved. On weekends, he'd taken young Keanu hiking through the forests surrounding Oak Ridge, teaching him to navigate using maps and compasses rather than relying on GPS. "Technology can fail you," he'd told him, pressing his favorite brass compass into his small hands. "But if you understand the principles behind it, you'll never truly be lost." It was during one of their regular Sunday phone calls that Keanu first noticed something concerning. "Dad, you're repeating yourself," he said gently, after he'd told him the same story about his neighbor's dog for the 3rd time in their conversation. "Am I?" Daniel laughed it off. "Must be getting old." But over the next few months, these moments of forgetfulness increased. Words escaped him mid-sentence. He struggled to follow complex conversations. At 58, it seemed too early for dementia, yet the symptoms resembled early-onset Alzheimer's. When Daniel began experiencing muscle tremors and coordination problems, Keanu insisted on comprehensive medical testing. The neurologist was baffled by the unusual combination of symptoms: cognitive decline paired with physical deterioration that didn't match typical disease patterns. Then came the morning Keanu received a call from the Oak Ridge Hospital. Daniel had collapsed at work and was undergoing emergency treatment. He took an immediate leave of absence and drove the 4 hours to Oak Ridge, his heart pounding with fear. When he arrived, the small community hospital was chaotic. Not just his father, but dozens of Oak Ridge residents had been admitted with similar neurological symptoms. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, pulled Keanu aside after he'd seen his sedated father. "This isn't an isolated case," Dr. Chen said quietly. "We've been seeing increasing neurological disorders in Oak Ridge residents for years, but there's been a sharp uptick in the past 18 months. The patterns are consistent with heavy metal poisoning, particularly lead and mercury." "That doesn't make sense," Keanu replied. "The EPA would have flagged contamination levels that high." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. Unless someone was ensuring those levels weren't properly reported. The implication hung in the air between them. "North Star," Keanu whispered. "I can't make accusations without evidence," Dr. Chen responded carefully. "But I've requested independent water testing. North Star's local influence runs deep, though. They employ half the town." Over the next 3 weeks, as Daniel's condition deteriorated, Keanu began his own investigation. He collected water samples from various locations, focusing on areas downstream from North Star's facility. He interviewed longtime residents, discovering patterns of illness that corresponded with employment duration at the plant. Most significantly, he found his father's personal notebooks. For years, Daniel had meticulously documented irregularities he'd observed in North Star's waste management protocols. Chemical compounds that disappeared from inventory without proper disposal records. Midnight maintenance operations that weren't. They logged pressure from management to modify safety reports. "I knew something was wrong," he told him during a moment of clarity, his once steady hands now constantly trembling. "But I needed proof before I could come forward." "Why didn't you tell me?" Keanu asked, fighting back tears. "I didn't want this burden for you," he replied, "and I thought I had more time." 2 months after his collapse, Daniel Reeves died. The official cause was listed as complications from rapidly progressing neurological disease of unknown origin. At his funeral, a colleague from North Star approached Keanu. "Your father was asking questions no one wanted answered," the woman whispered, slipping a USB drive into his hand before quickly walking away. The drive contained internal emails documenting North Star's awareness of groundwater contamination, dating back 15 years, along with systematic efforts to conceal testing results from regulators. The most damning communication was from North Star's CEO, Victor Harmon, explicitly rejecting a proposed remediation plan due to cost concerns, despite acknowledging the potential health impacts on local populations. Armed with this evidence, Keanu approached authorities. The response was underwhelming. Local officials, many with ties to North Star, dismissed his concerns. Environmental agencies promised investigations that never materialized. Media outlets initially showed interest, but quickly backed away. Keanu later learned that North Star's parent company owned significant stakes in regional news organizations. Finally, he found Emily Reynolds, an environmental justice attorney who recognized the significance of his evidence. Together, they built a case against North Star, filing a wrongful death suit on behalf of Daniel and laying groundwork for a potential class action for the broader community. What followed was a brutal legal battle. North Star's team of corporate lawyers exploited every procedural tactic to delay proceedings and drain Emily's limited resources. They questioned Keanu's credibility, suggesting his environmental background made him biased against industry. They hired experts who attributed Oak Ridge's health issues to lifestyle factors and genetic predisposition. Most devastating was their systematic dismantling of Daniel's character. They portrayed him as a disgruntled employee, mentally deteriorating and paranoid, whose documentation couldn't be trusted. His decades of loyal service meant nothing against their coordinated attack. Through it all, Keanu held on to his father's compass, a tangible reminder of the principles he'd lived by. "True north doesn't change," he told him once. No matter how lost you feel, it remains constant. As the trial finally began, Keano believed truth would prevail. He believed in the system, in justice, in the power of evidence to speak for itself. He was wrong. Back in his hotel room after the devastating verdict, Keano methodically spread his father's notebooks across the bed. 18 months of litigation had familiarized him with every page, every observation he'd documented. He wasn't looking for new evidence. He was looking for direction. His phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Just heard from a juror. 3 were holding out for us. Until the last minute, something spooked them. Call me." Keano set the phone aside. He couldn't face another conversation about legal strategies or appeals. Not tonight. A knock at his door startled him. Through the peephole, he saw the man with the crimson scarf from the courthouse steps. "Who is it?" he called, one hand on his phone, ready to call for help. "Mike Ellis," he replied. "I worked with your father in Lab 7. Keano hesitated before opening the door, chain still in place. The man was in his 60s with deep lines around his eyes and a slight tremor in his left hand that reminded him painfully of his father's symptoms. "I should have come forward during the trial," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But they threatened my pension, my health care, and I'm already showing symptoms." He removed the chain, letting him enter. Showing symptoms of what, exactly? Same thing that killed Danny. He gestured to his trembling hand. "Started about 6 months ago. That's how it begins." Keano led him to the room's single chair while he perched on the edge of the bed. The jury didn't believe the connection between the contamination and the neurological symptoms. "Because North Star buried the Fallbrook study," Mike said. "It established the causal link definitively. Your father helped design it." "What? There was no Fallbrook study in Discovery." Mike gave a bitter laugh. "Of course not. Victor Harmon had the results sealed, and the research team disbanded when they confirmed that prolonged exposure to the chemical compound, NP273, caused precisely the neurological degeneration we're seeing in Oak Ridge." "When was this?" Keano asked, his mind racing. 2015, Danny was devastated. He started keeping his own records after that, gathering evidence. He was planning to go public when his symptoms began. Mike leaned forward. "I have access to the original study data. It's still in the secure database, but I need someone on the inside to help me retrieve it." Keanu's breath caught. "Who?" "Hank Chen. He works in North Star's data security division." "Chen?" Keano recalled the doctor who had treated his father. "Any relation to Dr. Sarah Chen from Oak Ridge Hospital?" Mike nodded. "Her brother. Sarah's been documenting cases for years, building her own evidence separate from the hospital records. Between what I can access, what Hank can retrieve, and Sarah's clinical data, we can prove not just correlation but causation." Hope flickered in Keanu's chest for the first time since the verdict. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not during the trial?" Mike's eyes dropped to the compass lying among his father's notebooks. "Danny said if anything happened to him, I should find you. Said you'd have his compass and you'd know what to do with the truth." He looked up, his eyes glistening. "I was a coward, but watching you on those courthouse steps today, I saw Danny's courage in you. I can't stay silent anymore." Keano picked up the compass, watching as its needle swung toward Mike before settling firmly northwest, toward Oak Ridge. Toward the truth. "What would we be looking for exactly?" he asked. "Project Fallbrook documentation, lab results showing bioaccumulation of NP273 in tissue samples, and most importantly, the executive communications authorizing continued production despite known risks." Mike's voice strengthened as he spoke. Everything needed to prove North Star knowingly poisoned an entire community for profit. Keano thought of his father, of the other families mourning loved ones, while North Star's executives celebrated their legal victory. He thought of Oak Ridge's children, still drinking contaminated water because remediation was deemed too expensive. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we'd be going against one of the most powerful corporations in the country. They've already shown they'll destroy anyone who threatens them." "Your father knew the risks," Mike replied. "He still believed the truth had to come out." Keano ran his thumb across the weathered brass surface of the compass. The instrument had guided his father through wilderness and darkness for decades. Now it would guide him through something far more treacherous. "When do we start?" he asked. 3 months after the verdict, Keano stood at the edge of Oak Ridge Reservoir in pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming clouds in the cold February air. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Chen supervised as environmental technicians in hazmat suits collected water and soil samples. "Remember," Keano cautioned the team, "documentation is everything. Continuous video, multiple witnesses for each sample, and triple redundancy on chain of custody." Sarah nodded grimly. "We can't give them any procedural loopholes this time." This covert operation represented months of careful planning. With Mike's guidance and Hank Chen's technical assistance, they had assembled an independent coalition of scientists, medical professionals, and former North Star employees willing to risk retaliation to expose the truth. Emily had connected them with the Environmental Integrity Project, a non-profit with experience challenging corporate pollution. Their legal team was preparing to file both new civil litigation and a formal request for criminal investigation based on evidence of deliberate fraud in North Star's regulatory filings. Most crucially, they had obtained the suppressed Fallbrook study thanks to Hank's access to North Star's secure servers. The data conclusively linked NP-273 exposure to the precise neurological symptoms experienced by Oak Ridge residents, with risk correlating directly to proximity to the plant and duration of exposure. Keanu's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Emily. "CNN confirmed. They're running the story tonight, no going back now." He showed the message to Sarah, whose expression remained determined despite the fear visible in her eyes. Both understood that public exposure was their only protection against North Star's retaliation. Once the story broke, the evidence would be too widely disseminated to suppress. "My brother says they're already shredding documents at headquarters," Sarah said quietly. Someone tipped them off. "They can shred all they want," Keano replied. "We have the digital trail." As the sun began to rise over the reservoir, painting the water's surface with pale gold light, Keano felt his father's presence. He imagined him standing beside him, nodding approval at his refusal to accept defeat. The investigation team's lead scientist approached with preliminary readings from their testing equipment. "These levels are, Mr. Reeves, these are 10 times. What would trigger an EPA emergency response?" Keano wasn't surprised. "And they've been this high for years." "If that's true, the neurological impacts we're seeing now are just the beginning," the scientist said, her voice tense with professional horror. "The long-term effects on children born in this area could be devastating." The weight of this responsibility settled heavily on Keanu's shoulders. This wasn't just about justice for his father anymore. It was about the future of an entire community. By mid-morning, news vans began arriving. North Star's security personnel established a perimeter around the plant, preventing the investigation team from approaching company property. Local police appeared, initially attempting to shut down the sampling operation until Emily arrived with court orders authorizing the independent testing. As cameras rolled, capturing the confrontation between corporate security and environmental investigators, Mike Ellis stepped forward to give his first public statement, his left hand now trembling visibly as he described years of corporate cover-up. Keano watched from a distance, aware that his role would come later when the scientific evidence had been firmly established. He touched the compass in his pocket, drawing strength from this connection to his father. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the reservoir's edge. The back door opened, and a man in an expensive suit emerged, Victor Harmon, North Star's CEO. Keano hadn't seen him in person since the trial, where he had sat impassively as his lawyers systematically dismantled his case. Now, as he surveyed the scene with cold calculation, their eyes met across the distance. Recognition flickered in his expression, followed by something Keano hadn't expected: uncertainty. For the first time, Victor Harmon looked rattled. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reeves," said a voice he immediately identified as Harmon's from his court testimony. "This has gone far enough. Perhaps we should discuss a resolution that serves everyone's interests. Keanu watched him standing by his vehicle, phone to his ear, finally forced to acknowledge him as a threat rather than an annoyance. A resolution? He repeated, letting ice fill his voice. Like the resolution you offered my father when he raised concerns about safety violations? Or the resolution you imposed on Oak Ridge by poisoning its water for 20 years? This approach benefits no one, Harmon countered smoothly. North Star employs thousands. A public health scare could devastate the regional economy. You mean it could devastate your stock price, Keanu replied. I'm prepared to offer substantial compensation to affected families, he continued as if he hadn't spoken. A community health fund, environmental remediation, all without the uncertainty and delay of litigation. Keanu considered his offer, recognizing it as the first crack in North Star's wall of denial. They were scared. Any resolution, he said, carefully, would require full disclosure of all internal documents relating to water contamination, comprehensive health screening for every Oak Ridge resident, and establishment of an independent monitoring system with regulatory authority over North Star's operations. Impossible, Harmon snapped. My board would never... Then I'll see you in court, Keanu interrupted. Again. But this time with evidence your lawyers can't bury. He ended the call and watched as Harmon stalked back to his vehicle, barking orders at his entourage. Sarah approached, her expression questioning. What was that about? They're offering a settlement, Keanu explained, which means they know. We have them. Sarah's eyes widened. You didn't accept, did you? No, Keanu replied. But their willingness to negotiate just confirmed what we suspected. They know exactly what they did. As the day progressed, more former North Star employees came forward, encouraged by Mike's example. Local residents gathered at the reservoir, sharing stories of illness and loss. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting images of the investigation nationwide. By evening, the governor had announced the formation of a special task force. The EPA dispatched an emergency response team. Senators from both parties called for congressional hearings. Standing at the center of this unfolding reckoning, Keanu finally felt the truth of what his father had taught him about his compass. True north doesn't change. The principles of right and wrong remain constant, even when powerful forces try to reorient the world around their interests. That night, as the investigation lights reflected off the reservoir's dark surface, Keanu walked to the water's edge. He opened his hand and looked down at his father's compass one last time. We found our way, Dad, he whispered. Then, with a deliberate motion, he returned the compass to his pocket. He wouldn't be needing it to guide him anymore. The path forward was clear. 6 months later, Keanu stood in Oak Ridge Memorial Park, watching as workers installed a stone monument engraved with the names of 27 residents who had died from conditions linked to chemical exposure. His father's name was third on the list. The park itself had been renamed as part of North Star's settlement agreement, which had ultimately included everything Keanu demanded and more. The company had admitted wrongdoing, agreed to criminal penalties for its executives, and committed billions to remediation and healthcare for affected residents. Victor Harmon was awaiting trial on charges of criminal negligence and fraud. Mike Ellis and both Chen's siblings had received whistleblower protections and compensation. Most importantly, comprehensive testing and treatment programs were now available to everyone in the affected area. Emily joined Keanu at the monument, placing a hand on his shoulder. The class action settlement was approved this morning, she said. It's officially over. Keanu nodded, his emotions too complex for words. Victory felt hollow with his father still gone, yet he knew he would have considered this outcome worth the sacrifice. A young woman approached them hesitantly, holding a toddler's hand. Mr. Reeves, I'm Jessica Lawson. My husband worked at North Star for 15 years before he passed away last year. Keanu recognized the name from the monument. I just wanted to thank you, Jessica continued, her voice breaking slightly. The settlement means I can keep our house, get Tommy here the specialized care he needs. She looked down at her son, who showed subtle signs of developmental delays. But more than that, you gave us the truth. You made them admit what they did. Emily discreetly stepped away, giving them privacy. I had help, Keanu said. Many people risked everything. But you started it, Jessica insisted. When everyone said to accept the verdict and move on, you didn't. You fought for all of us. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small item, pressing it into Keanu's hand. Tom would want you to have this. It was a pocket watch, weathered, and well-loved. He used to say that some things are timeless, Jessica explained. Truth, justice, the courage to stand up for what's right. He carried this watch to remind himself that there's always time to do the right thing, even when it seems too late. Keanu's fingers closed around the watch, feeling its weight, similar yet distinct from his father's compass. Not a guide pointing the way forward, but a reminder that each moment presented a choice. As Jessica and her son walked away, Keanu looked around the park where he had played as a child, now transformed into a memorial and a promise. Oakridge would recover. The water would run clean again. The truth had prevailed. He thought of his father's final coherent words to him. Some battles choose you, Keanu. The question isn't whether you'll fight, but how you'll fight when the time comes. Keanu slipped the pocket watch into his jacket, alongside the compass, two instruments from different men who had lived by the same principles, two reminders that even in the darkest times, direction and purpose could be found. He turned toward the path leading out of the park, ready to begin the next chapter. There were other communities like Oakridge, other corporations like North Star, other battles that needed fighting. And now he knew exactly how to find his way.